Okay, so how do we go about recoding this to do what we want to do? Well, essentially what we're going to do for this marital status variable is set up 3 dummy variables, which are coded as 0 as 1. And to do that, essentially we would go into each of these, and for each of these categories we're going to set up a new variable where, let's say in this one, 1 equals divorce, 0 equals everyone else. This one, for married, 1 would equals married, 0 equals everything else, and for never married, 1 would equal never married, and 0 would equal everything else. So how would we go about doing that? Well, we go and we click on our Recode in a different variable. Let's ignore this, I was messing around with stuff earlier. Go to marital status. So when you come to this Recode in a different variable section, let me go back a second. When you want to transform, you have a couple different options. I always recommend recoding into a different variable. That way, if you make any mistakes, it doesn't mess up your original variable and you can retry what you're doing. So recode into a different variable. We want to take our marital status variable, send it over here, and then we want to look at first, okay, let's do our divorce variable first. First thing we want to do is create new names for this. This is what this output variable is doing. It's creating the new name for your new dummy variable. And then under old and new variables, we can ignore this for now. But you want to, okay. If we think back to our original coding, divorce was coded as 1. We still want that to be a 1, so click 1 in the old value here, 1 in the new value, and then click add. That's what that does there. And then when you're recoding this way, you could continue putting stuff in, but since we're recoding this way, we could click all other variables down here and make all other variables a 0 and add that. So what this is going to create is a variable where 0 equals every other variable and 1 equals divorce. So essentially it's a variable indicating whether a person was divorced or not. Then we click continue. Let's see. And click OK here. As you can see, there's our first new variable created, divorced. And if you go back and look at it here, we got another variable with a bunch of 1s and 0s. Now we need to do that for each of our variables. So that's already transferred over. So let's just change this into married. Change the name again, old and new values. Let's remove that, come in and do value, and our thing married was 2, so we put 2 here, and then new value is 1. So this is creating a variable where it's showing essentially if somebody's married, they're a 1, if not, they go into the 0 category with everything else. And once again, we click OK. We get another new variable here. Finally, we go back and do our last variable the exact same way. Change the name to never married. Change that. Old and new variables. Again, remove this one. Go back, put the old variable for never married was 3, and we're changing that to a 1. And there's our third variable created. So now what we have from that, we have 3 new variables essentially representing whether a person is divorced, 1 equals yes, 0 no, married, 1 equals yes, 0 no, and never married, where 1 equals they were never married and 0 means that they were either divorced or married. So now when we run this into the regression, we're actually going to get a little bit into multiple regression here, but you don't need to worry about too much of the stuff yet because I'll talk about that next week. I just want to show you guys when you're doing this, we're going to go to Analyze, Regression, Linear. You see we have all our new variables down here, divorced, married, never married. Whenever you're doing a dummy variable and you take multiple categories that you're comparing and you do it this way, we're going to pick a essentially comparison category. Let's say we're going to make that married here just because that's the one that we theoretically think correlates with happiness the most. So we're going to make that our comparison variable. Now that what you make your comparison variable really doesn't matter. It's usually a theoretical, or sometimes if one variable has a lot more people in that variable than the other, sometimes you'll make that the comparison variable by default. But in this case, it doesn't matter so much. We're going to make married our default, and what that means is we're actually going to leave that out of the independent list. We'll put the other two variables here. And what this does, and I'm not really going to get into how this works, but what this does, it's going to essentially run the regression, and your results are going to indicate divorced versus married, and never married versus married. So if we click OK, we can get our results from this. And again, we're actually running a multiple regression here, but I'll talk about that more next week. Right now, I just want you to understand the interpretation. So what we actually get here, kind of expanding on what we talked about we got multiple variables here, and I'll talk about, again, this is technically a multiple regression, so there's other assumptions and stuff we wouldn't need to worry about, but for now, you guys don't need to worry about that. I just want you to worry about the interpretation and knowing how to recode these variables, and knowing that you leave out your comparison variable when you run the analysis, and then also how do you interpret this. So first thing we notice is that both of these variables were significant. First one would be divorced. This is essentially because we left married out as the comparison variable. This is a comparison between divorced people and married people. And so that's going to, again, remember back how we interpreted the gender category. Our variable that we ran, which is divorced, essentially is represented here, meaning that because this is negative, divorced people, essentially for this sample, we interpret this as follows. For this sample, divorced people scored 1.647 units or points lower on the happiness scale compared to married individuals. And then actually never married individuals, you could say that never married individuals scored 1.662 points higher on the happiness scale compared to married individuals. So you can see that gives us kind of interesting results from both there. It's essentially showing us that divorced people are less happy than married people, but never married people are more happy than married people. Now again, this is completely made up data, so don't think this reflects reality anyway. So that's essentially dummy variables in a nutshell. The interpretation's a little different. We'll talk about these a bit more when we get to multiple regression. Some of some of the key things to remember from this audio lecture. You want to remember, okay, how do we interpret dummy variables? And again, it's not that 1 unit increase. It's essentially comparing one of your variables directly to your comparison variable, which is when you just have two variables, it's your 1 compared to your 0. When you have multiple variables, it's the variable that's included in that row compared to the variable you left out of the analysis. So in this case, divorced compared to married. In this case, never married compared to married. Now, you could change that comparison variable and essentially interpret this different ways. So if you wanted to compare married and never married to divorced, you would leave divorced out and then run it with married and never married in the regression. But again, usually you do that based on whichever one you think is going to be the most interesting one to compare the other variables to. Now, just some last closing remarks here. Why would we ever use dummy variables? Well, there are a lot of categorical variables that we run into in the criminal justice field and in social sciences in general that we would like to see the relationship. For example, obviously gender is a big one. These things like are you married or not, we want to see those relationships, but since they're usually coded in this way that's normally not meaningful, this is the only way to do that. In some cases, even if we have an interval variable, it might even be interesting to change it into a dummy variable. For example, if you were looking at age groups, middle age versus young people versus elderly people, and looking at their fear of crime or some type of other variable, you might get better, more distinguished results if you turn those into dummy variables and recode those into dummy variables compared to looking at it as an interval variable. And I might talk about that a little bit more later, but sometimes it's just interesting to break things down into these categories. So that's going to finish us up for this week. You guys have an assignment for this week, and I am getting rid of the quiz for this week so you guys don't have a quiz. I know there's a quiz on the syllabus, but I'm going to forego that for this week, so all you guys have other than this is your assignment. So you guys have a great week, and if you have any questions about this, feel free to email me and we can figure things out. Have a great week.